Cool, so thank you for coming, everybody. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we'll kick off. We're going to try and keep everything to an hour. This is now the third BDF question time today. And we're focusing today on hacking and identity and media and politics, a little bit about open source, and some discussion at the end maybe about robotics, if we get to that. I have with me on the panel today James Davenport, who's Hebron Medlock Professor of Information Technology at Bath University, James Hobbs, who's Owner Experience Development Manager at Dyson, Errol Fox, who's a Production and UX Designer at Ushahidi. Kevin O'Malley, who's Innovation Lead at Innovate UK, Jay Cromack, who's CTO and founder at My Life Digital, and also one of our sponsors of the Digital Festival, who kind of make it all possible, I should say. Matt Jukes, who's a product expert at No Binary and formerly of the Office of National Statistics and the BBC. And Melinda Clayman, to my left here, UX researcher at Google. So could we go to question number one, please?
My children have grown up in a world where we've been allowed to share everything we do on social media platforms we thought were relatively safe. Following a number of high-profile hacks, are they now at risk of losing their identity? And what can I do to protect them from ongoing identity theft?
Jay, we start with you.
Yeah, I guess. So where we come from, it's not so much what can we do to prevent them, it's more what should the organisation be doing to stop them from or to protect their data. I think the challenge is these days is there's too many organisations out there that are just hoovering up our data, and we're not really sure what they're going to be doing with it, for what purpose and so on. And sorry if I'm going to use my language, but I think that the challenge is, and there's been laws since 1998 in the UK to try and protect people's data, but it was very old school. It was about a name and address, and obviously the digital world has moved on really, really fast. And the laws weren't really keeping up with that. And only recently, and dare I say it, this thing that got released or was enforceable from May 25th this year. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? I'm desperately trying not to say the word. I think it was time that something like that was actually put in place. So whilst I don't think kids are going to do what kids do, and it's down to parents to behave. And I've got two kids now who are much older, and they seriously misbehave on Facebook and stuff. But I think it's more recognising that people will be people and they will behave the way they behave. Therefore, it's really important that organisations take responsibility for their actions. And if you look at certain organisations, I have to be careful knowing now who's on the panel. There's a lot of really good articles out there around how, even with these new laws, how the organisations are trying to get us to agree to giving up our data and clicking the privacy button and saying we're all good. And a lot of UX design has gone into that. And I know people are trying to go against it. But I think it's not down necessarily to parents. I think it's down to the organisations to be really responsible in terms of how that data is being collected, how it's being used, and how they're protecting. Because this data protection law is not so much about the hacking. In fact, that's a really small part of it. It's actually more down to how the data is being used by the organisation and being shared across different people.
So James Davenport, do you agree that it's partly the responsibility of the organisations to behave?
Well, partly, but also it's a matter of quite refined common sense. So, for example, if you've told people on, say, Facebook who your parents are, choosing what is your mother's maiden name as an identity question is not very clever. If you've described in great detail your childhood and your favourite pets, choosing what was your first pet as your identity question is not very clever, and so on. So it's not just the social media themselves. For example, I have a certain social media profile, but I'm very careful to separate that from identity questions and things like that. Because questions specifically about identity. But certainly, but common sense needs to be pretty refined here. It must be said, it's uncommon common sense to be so careful with those questions. And of course, many of us have got old ones like that. We tend not to go back and look at them. We tend perhaps not to be as careful as we should do about this. I'm not sure social media by themselves make us any more liable to identity theft. Social media plus laziness plus not thinking it through certainly do. Whose fault is it if you choose your mother's maiden name and that's used from a social media profile? I find it hard to believe that's actually Facebook's fault if you chose to share it. If you want it kept private and nevertheless it came out, then that's a different question, of course. So I think it's a more nuanced question back. It's certainly become a more difficult question, and I don't see the point I've just mentioned being brought up in any of the basic Get Safe Online training and so on, for example. So that's something where we probably ought to look at those trainings and documents in the light of the social media challenge. Thank you.
Errol, if I understand about Ushahidi, it covers a demographic of people who are all over the world, not necessarily governed by the acronym we're not going to mention, and sharing a lot of potentially quite personal data. Mm-hmm. Are there protections in place to educate people about the data that they're sharing and the potential to lose their geography, their location, their identity?
Yeah, there certainly are, and I'm glad that we've managed to kind of talk a little bit more globally about this issue as well, because I think sometimes we do stay within our sphere of understanding about how we approach these issues. So, I mean, Ushahidi as a data collection platform that is open source is GDPR compliant. Oh, I used the acronym, oh no. Oh, I broke the seal of that. Anyway, so now everyone can say it. So we're completely compliant, and we're very careful around anonymized data, but we're also very careful around verification of data as well. So there's a lot of strengths built into the Ushahidi platform and the way that we work that is very focused on verifying data sources through trusted sources, advocating for those with marginalized voices. And I think one of the things that I would really like is slightly off piece, but it's about how in the developing world, or again, a problematic term, but in other places that have less access to tech, some of the only ways that you can access the internet are through social media sites. So take some of your East African countries when you go get your mobile device. Some of them come with a Facebook profile pre-installed, and that's how you access the internet. Some people from countries like that actually think, sorry, I've got a cold at the moment as well, so if I go a bit croaky. But some people think that that is the portal to the internet. It's how they get their news. It's how they share information. That's problematic in a different way, in the same way that through some of the election violence that we work with in Kenya, how you can then have that problem exacerbates within those bubbles is another challenge to look at. But I think there's something really, really key to look at in countries that are, becoming more and more tech, have more and more access to tech, like what it means for them. And there's also a question around like biometrics and how biometrics are coming into play in countries like that around identity. Is there something more to be said about identification around biometrics and the resistance against that, but also what it facilitates? There's actually an amazing report as far as like the usage of social media within sub-Saharan African countries. It's called Izulu, if you want to look it up. It's an excellent report that details the usage of mobile devices for business, for social, and how integral it is really to people's lives.
Okay, thank you. James Hobbs, do you agree? Do you think it's a global problem and that we live in a little bit of a European bubble in terms of protection?
Definitely, yeah. I think. Can I say it?
It's only because I get fined in the office every time.
Oh, it's like a swear jar.
Jar.
Okay. The acronym that shall
I'm the
not
biggest
be named.
advocate of it, to be honest.
Yeah. So I think GDPR, as we mentioned earlier, it's a good thing. It's only one step in the right direction. It is very EU-centric. I think, from what I remember, the intention is that companies operating outside of the EU, if they're interacting with EU customers, they're still within scope. They can be dragged in front of whoever and find. In practice, we haven't really seen any action yet from that. I don't know how effective it's going to be. But the point Errol made about the way different people consume the internet is a really good one, because China, for example, a lot of people's access to services and things over there through things like WeChat and Weibo and that kind of stuff. It's a very different model of interacting with the internet to what we've got here. Africa, and you know, it is a global problem. I think identity theft is incredibly commonplace. To go back to the original question, like most problems like this, there's lots of kind of subtleties to it, but one of the things that we should be looking at, I think, is educating the children on how to use it. Common sense is a huge part of that, certainly, but I think, you know, if you can make them as streetwise about using the internet as you can about them crossing the road and all of the other things that parents spend a long time doing, then you're only going to be arming them to defend themselves against this kind of stuff. Because a lot of it can be mitigated by common sense. But the parents need to understand it first before they can educate their children on how to mitigate some of the horrible stuff that goes on. And
Melinda, you are focused on the next billion users. Mm-hmm. Is it fair to assume that next billion users are demographically perhaps young and perhaps in countries that are less used to having access to the internet?
Absolutely. So these are people who are new to the internet, and these are often in countries where people are, you know, half of the population is below 25. And so the first way that they're coming online is through their mobile device, and often through programs like Facebook's, you know, free access, but only through Facebook. And yeah, they don't have the same mental model that I have, because, you know, I was around before the internet and I saw the way things developed, and I understand, you know, how things are structured. And I'm a UX researcher at Google, and my partner is a computing professor. So I'm not really worried about my kid, because she's going to be taught to use very safe passwords, and to not post things in certain ways, and to be more aware of the kinds of other platforms that have access within these platforms. Because maybe you trust, I mean, I trust Google, what can I say? But lots of other platforms have access within there. It's a bit more obvious with Facebook, you know, all these different apps that want to get in there, and those are the ones that you have to be probably more suspicious of. They're the ones who are like mining your data. And yeah, just most people do not have that mental model. Young people do not understand the indexing and the phishing, and so it is about education, but it's not a very simple thing to educate people on. So I guess I just want to agree with what everybody so far has said about, you know, it's the responsibility of these companies to protect it, and it's also the responsibility of the parents to educate the children. There's no simple answer, and I think that if there's opportunity to exploit any weakness, it will be exploited by someone out there. So we do all have to be vigilant.
Thanks. Matt, I'm going to come to you next. I just want to say, if anyone has any questions they want to ask, just sort of put your hand up and signal to me, and I will come through to you. Matt, do you think it's the responsibility of the person designing the service to make sure that people are aware of what they're giving away?
So I tend to think of it as almost like road safety, in this idea that, you know, there's responsibility on both sides. So, you know, manufacturers of cars have to pass an enormous amount of safety checks before they're allowed to put cars on the road, but you don't let people drive those cars until they've passed the test. I mean, I think the responsibility falls on both sides, and it is an education matter. And people like Mozilla Foundation have been doing amazing stuff around kind of web literacy for a really long time. And I think that sort of stuff's really important. Like, my biggest worry in this country is off to the side a bit, is we talk all the time about getting kids to code, which is cool and all of that, but actually, you know, just because they code doesn't mean they're any more sensible on the internet than before they learned to code. I think these are different things, and we need to focus more on that, and that's a real thing. And Everyone in the UK, who are a kind of charity think tank, I've done some really impressive stuff around being a better interneter, which is a little campaign about actually how to approach these things better. So I think there's a whole side on education and that sort of thing. But I also, you know, GDPR is great and everything, but I do think it's just one step, and we still have a situation in this country and in most of the kind of Western world and everywhere where our lawmakers don't understand the internet. Like fundamentally don't understand the internet. So regulation can't keep up. So protections can't keep up. So actually, until we get to a point where the kind of things that made internet giants as nervous as GDPR did are more regular, where they're actually ahead of thinking about, so they're not reacting to something that they were really surprised became law, but actually they're having to think about these things all the time, then I think that starts to create a safer playing field for the next generation. But it has to be both sides. We have to enforce better behavior from the internet giants, but we also have to teach everyone to understand this stuff better. And that's what, and I do worry about that. I hate the kind of digital native term, because just because people grew up in this internet age doesn't mean that they understand how to act. Like I grew up in the age of people driving cars, and I still can't bloody drive a car. You know what I mean? So, I mean, one thing doesn't equal the other, and I think we have to take that seriously.
Sorry, can I just...
Please. Yeah.
I think that the problem is that, you say that kind of policymakers don't understand the internet. I think the problem is, though, there are organisations out there that are just too powerful, that are just slowing things down as well. So if you look at things like the electronic privacy regulation, which is going to be even bigger than GDPR, that is now absolutely buried. I mean, they've been trying to get that up and running. They were trying to get it launched in time for, May 25th this year. It's now looking likely it's not going to become anywhere close to being enforceable until 2020, probably even 21. And it's because there's just too much depending on, there's too many powerful voices that are prepared to keep chucking money at keeping it kind of slowed down.
I think, but I absolutely agree, and I've been working in government for a long time, so I kind of understand that, and I know people in Parliament and stuff. But at the same time, there are campaigning groups with massive piles of money in all sorts of things, is the reality. And the only way you can push back on that is a better educated legislator, is the reality. Like Google are not going to stop lobbying and not going to put their money away. Facebook are not going to stop doing these things. We can't change that, so there's no point moaning about it to some extent. We have to actually create a better way of fighting back against it. And you have to pick your battles, essentially.
So Kevin, can some of our innovation spend be focused on educating our politicians about this stuff? And
well, I think the simple answer is probably no. But I think they need.
Hancock's got his own app.
Wow. I think there definitely needs to be some resources put towards increasing that understanding within legislators. But also, government is a hell of a big beast, and it moves really slowly. It's designed to move slowly so that there can be that consideration and that sort of options appraisal. So it's a feature, not a bug. It's meant to be slow. It's meant to be deliberative, and it was designed for a different era. If we're trying to keep up with agile, nimble tech giants, then we're going to break the government that we've got.
Do you think they understand what they're trying to keep up with?
Absolutely not. I think there are components, there are elements of government which are beginning to develop that expertise. GDS obviously being a fantastic example, but that's not mainstream by any means. And I don't know how you make that cultural change to educate the entire civil service to understand the implications of things which are happening now or are on the horizon. It's a hell of a task.
And Errol, do you find that, do you think that other governments in other areas of the world are more savvy about technology, or do you think that we have a very tech-savvy, comparatively tech-savvy government?
I think that the citizens of certain countries, Kenya is an example of the one that I know reasonably well, are much more ready and equipped to challenge their governments. So I think that putting technology in the hands of the citizens has been great for that kind of advocacy work. I think the governments see it as a pain, as far as I can tell. So I don't think that there's the same kind of relationship in conflicted, especially around kind of government or elections kind of context. Yeah.
And as Google, do you work with governments?
I don't. I just wanted to pile on to that. You know, in India, they rejected the free Facebook thing. I forget what it was called.
At a governmental level or at a user level?
There were so many protests. Do you know about it?
Yeah, it wasn't at a governmental level. It was the people that protested against it, because what ended up happening was they partnered with a company called Reliance to create Geo, which enabled Facebook to give free internet access, but it was kind of going against net neutrality. And what ended up happening was a lot of the major YouTubers started having campaigns, and they petitioned to get rid of it. And that's when the entire population kind of swayed.
There was a connection with Geo?
Yeah.
I didn't know about that.
And because it erodes net neutrality?
Yeah, that was another issue, because it was, so what Facebook had actually done was partnered, I believe, with Amazon, like one of its partners, where they said, oh, we'll send all our customers to Amazon and get rid of all the other competitive sites. So that just...
Right, so whereas they embraced it in certain countries, in India it totally fell on its face. And it was basically, grassroots activism that rejected it.
Okay. So we're going to go to our second question then. Can I have question number 2 from the audience?
Can I trust anything I read online?
Matt, let's go to you.
No. But yeah, it's a bit more. So I think we're in a. I read this book recently by a journalist called James Ball, which was called Post-Truth: The Age of Bullshit. And it's a really good thing, because it's this whole book about the fact that none of this is new. It's just that it's a different scale because of the internet. And actually, fake news is a terrible term and should be completely blacked out and ignored. But actually, there is an issue with kind of misinformation and disinformation. And I think it's an incredibly kind of nuanced thing. There's an organisation called 4Fact in the UK, 4fact.org, who kind of are fact checkers, and I know a bunch of them. And they do a lot more thinking about this sort of stuff, and have a much more kind of nuanced approach of what can be changed and how you can tell. But when it comes down to it, it's the same as before. It's an education issue. I mean, actually, at a certain level of education and awareness and analysis, people don't necessarily get taken in by fake news stories or by completely things that are spammed to such an extent that you know deep down in your soul that someone's been paid to write that, to change your opinion. And I think the fact is that, again, it becomes an education issue on how you give people the literacy to identify them, and how you kind of can, in your own head, make the decisions about what to believe and what not to believe. But it's not going away. And Facebook are a million miles from tidying up their platform as far as all the craziness is on there. And Twitter haven't even started, as far as I can tell. So that's where we are.
Melinda, as a portal to the internet, Google has the power to become an echo chamber for certain users. So I guess in this country, we may be quite savvy about the news that we read. In America, which we maybe just don't need to touch on, but for this next billion users, how well educated are they, and how clearly do you think they can identify what is real and what is not?
You know, the first time I heard about fake news was when I was in India like 5 or 6 years ago, and people were getting passed on WhatsApp all these fake news stories. And they knew some of them were kind of dodgy, and so they would go onto Google to fact check for themselves. And I've asked a lot of people over the years, like, how do you know what's true? And so the strategies people usually have are if it's from a source that they've heard of, and lots of times, particularly in India, they go to YouTube first rather than Google. They prefer video, and so the more views kind of indicates that it's true. If they go on Twitter, if it's like a verified check thing, and then they can believe it's that person themselves saying what it is about themselves. But then you have people like my dear leader, who goes around just spewing out falsehoods all the time, and so it is coming from the horse's mouth, but you can't believe it anyway. So all of these strategies definitely have problems with them, and it's certainly been something on my mind very much, is what can Google do to help people authenticate, like what they're seeing. This is the right answer. This is the one you should trust. And if anybody has an idea, let me know.
Can you trust score it?
Can you trust?
Could you trust score it?
Trust score it. Yeah, like where would that come from? Like this source is often cited. This is, if you go on like Google Scholar, it will say this is cited in so many publications. And I think that's helpful to people who know about Google Scholar, and maybe that particular feature could be brought into just regular Google.
Depending on who's paying for the papers that are the citations.
Well, I think they're usually academic, so I mean,
So they're funded by someone.
Okay, yeah, you don't know. You don't know. Yeah.
Is there a way we can? Is there a solution that we can develop, do you think? Is that something that you would promote?
I'd love to think that there was, and I think there'd be huge business in it for somebody if they could develop a technological solution. I'm a bit more concerned about what happens next, because I think this has been a really big punch for democracy and for debate in all across the Western world, and we're reeling from that. But I think down the line there are even more terrifying things, just to scare everybody more. I was looking at some deep fakes today, videos which have been doctored to appear to be authentic videos. Now, I can read a tweet and I can discount it very readily, but if somebody shows me a video of Obama saying something horrific and it looks authentic, it looks legitimate, then that's something that's going to really stick with me, and something that I might legitimately share with my friends, believing it to be true. I think we've got to be prepared, much more prepared than we were for this first assault, which to some extent I think was an organised attack on our dialogue and debate. We have to be much more prepared for what's coming next, and technically I think it's going to be much more sophisticated.
James Hobbs, do you think we're seeing the end of trust?
The end of trust, that sounds
end
apocalyptic. I think we need to, I think part of the problem is that like deepfakes is a really good example, and some technology Adobe's developed that allows, with enough source material, I can make you say anything I want, for example.
Were you looking at me? Or
yeah, I was looking at you.
Right.
Yeah.
We can do that with a few beers.
Well, it's cheaper. And I think the kind of pace of technological progress with some of this technology has been, it's hurtling forwards, but what hasn't accompanied it is the ability to discern a deep fake from not. And currently, I think there are some techniques that can be used. There's some obvious sort of artifacts on some of these videos. Those things will go away. The technology will improve, and then it will become next to impossible to tell the difference between what someone said and what hasn't. So I think some of the companies creating this technology should, take it upon themselves to also consider how it might be used, and how it might be, combated where necessary. It's incredibly clever. I'm sure it's got lots of altruistic uses, but everyone can see how it could be abused. And these things spread like wildfire. If someone put a video of you up saying something really horrible, then that'd be round the whole festival within seconds, and there'd be nothing you could do. So
everyone would believe it.
Yeah, well, obviously, upstanding gentlemen. I think there needs to be some responsibility when people are releasing this kind of technology, even in an academic sense. The repercussions need to be thought through more carefully. It doesn't mean we should stifle things like this, because we shouldn't. Apart from anything else, it's really cool, it's really clever how it works, but there needs to be some responsibility there as well.
Harold, have you come across this technology, and do you think it's just a Western problem, or presumably this technology can be used globally?
Yeah, so I'm interested in I feel like the focus of the discussion has been on the type of content that we're consuming, but not necessarily then what we're doing with it. So we've talked a lot about we've seen a thing and we decide whether or not we believe that thing. And I think that there is very real questionableness about whether we trust that thing. But one of the things that I'd love to briefly talk about is with one of our projects around the Kenyan elections, which is Uchaguzi, is about whether or not you can trust sources and then have them verified. And then there's another question about what you're doing with that information. So I can share a link to how the Uchaguzi process was set up. And you can take a look at all the ways that the sources are verified. But say, so the way that we did it, as a quick example, is say there was a small polling station. Some people sent in some reports to the Ushahidi platform saying there is a fire here, there's some violence, there's something happening that needs some kind of emergency service attention. Now, as a general consumer, you can take a look at that piece of information and you can choose to believe whether that's fake news or not. But with the process that Uchaguzi and Ushahidi put in place around the trusted sources, we work with various partners that work within those localities as well. But again, this is another sticking point that we were recently at a UN conference talking about, like election violence and how to mitigate it. But working with partners is a hard thing to do, but you have to build that relationship over a long time. So we go through the process of like verifying whether that source is trusted or not to then send the aid. So that's kind of an example of more of a source that needs an action rather than you making a decision personally on what you think or choose to believe. But you've got deployments that have used Ushahidi, like we've got one that's one of my personal favourites, which is Mapping Media Freedom, where it's a group of European activists that have used the Ushahidi platform to collect instances of where media freedoms have been violated. And that's all different sources straight from the internet and reports that they've collected. And again, it's good to see things being collected and questioned around those kinds of things as well. But, yeah.
So, James Davenport, do you think that that's the solution, to crowdsource a level of trust?
To some extent, yes, and certainly when you get, as you were talking, Albert, reports about from many instances about something and happening or not, crowdsourcing is, and there is no responsible, reliable journalist there. You know, the crowdsource is probably all you can do, and it's probably the best you can do, and it's certainly a lot better than just believing one report. The other question is actually educate people to look at the provenance of things and where things actually come from. And that's particularly in the presence of deep fakes. What that means is that I cannot trust the video I see of, let's say, President Obama saying something unless I know where that video came from. If, for example, it comes from the BBC or, say, CNN or something, I have a certain credibility with it. If it comes to Fox News, probably rather less, and so on. But and if it comes to much randomly off the internet, these days close to zero, frankly. But so it's a case of educating people to go and ask where it comes from. And that's, in the days of things like glyph swatting on, that's difficult but not impossible. And we need to educate people that we know that just because it's printed doesn't mean it's true. If I was in Cafe Nero, I saw a few bits of paper, and I saw a copy of what looked like the Times. The copy of what looked like the Times was printed on clearly a very expensive printing machine, almost certainly was the Times. Someone's not going to produce an alternative printing machine or produce fake copies of the Times put in Cafe Nero. It's just economically infeasible. Of course, whether I now believe what's written in the Times is a question. I'm fairly sure that was the Times. And I'm much less sure that this piece of paper labelled Greenpeace was actually from Greenpeace. It probably was, but I certainly can't be sure of that. And if it was labelled House of Commons, it almost certainly wasn't House of Commons, because they leave House of Commons papers lying around in Cafe Nero. But you need to ask yourself where did one hopes. No, not loose. Yeah, well, not loose. But yes, yeah. I'm not. I pay them far too much. But yeah, I just say there's a rant. I use Cafe Nero as a physical example, analogous to the internet, and even Cafe Nero. But yeah, our senses attune us to the physical provenance. Yep. They don't currently attune us to the digital provenance, and that's the problem.
I think, sorry, just to say, crowdsourcing isn't necessarily infallible. We do often get a lot of, in Ichiguzi and a lot of our different deployments, we get fake deployments being put up. Deployment is what we call an instance of using our platform on Ushahidi. And we also get people, which we call bad actors. So you get people sending in fake reports to things to try and a lot of that is around these kinds of, specifically in an Ushahidi case, around these kind of tribal divisions of where people are getting elected officials that will try and plant certain information to influence an election. So this does happen, but that's why the structure of verification and the way that the platform facilitates that verification is so important to the citizens.
Yep. Did we have a question for the...
To go back to the video and photo source, Google offer a useful tool with kind of reverse engineering where you can upload a photo or a video and you can see if this video has been manipulated or not according to...
So sorry, you're saying there is already a tool in
You
existence?
can do a search for a video, for an image or either video or image. I'm sure you can explain that.
Certainly for an image, you can search for where else it's appeared.
This photo has been manipulated or not, or what the angle of the picture or the image has been taken for. I think you can do that as well on video because the research you do, you can see, for example, the video you were talking about Obama, I know which one you're talking about.
Right.
But you will see that the original Obama talk was very different. So I think you can do this kind of reverse type of engineering.
So Joe, do you think you leave it in the hands of the end user to verify what they're watching?
Partly. I mean, I just find a lot of the, not here, but you know, this whole thing, we're kind of just digitizing propaganda because I mean, we've been doing this for years. You know, British Army, British, you know, used to drop leaflets on people to try and swing elections. So you know, it's not as if this is anything new. So I just think it's obviously more widespread because of what we're seeing. So I think, you know, we need to look at it. I think, you know, for people, it's, you know, it's an opportunity that, you know, I think trust scores are the way to deal with it. I think it's going to come down to curation platforms that will kind of manage that process for us. We will have our favoured platform that we know will curate the most trusted sources that we're prepared to read. And I think that's how it's going to have to go, because otherwise, you know, you're not going to know what you're reading.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that I never read any fake news. It's only people who disagree with me who reads all that stuff. So I think we're all in the same
I totally disagree on that one. In that I think we're already in this incredibly polarized society, and the fact is, if you told me to go and look at something on a Breitbart website, I would know everything on there was false. And if I told someone to go and look at the Canary, they would know everything on there was false. And yet there's still millions of people who look at one and millions of people who look at the other. And it doesn't make any difference, the trust scores or whatever, because all the people on one of them won't trust anything that you say is trustworthy.
Right.
So then do you not think that legislation needs to come in to
I
kind of prevent that?
So
that's kind of where I'm going with.
Yeah, but I just think there's a lot more nuance in it. I think if you rely on things to be curated, certainly I would never trust an AI to do any of this sort of thing. Is any kind of curation around this sort of space only reinforces that polarization. And the fact is, like you say, like,
because you don't trust the curator.
Well, because you trust the curator that you trust, and if you and that's how we've got into this mess. That's how these bubbles have got us into this mess in the first place. Is like actually, you know, I have this weird double life where I've got lots of friends like you kind of people, and I grew up in a council estate in Bristol, and I've got a lot of friends who didn't vote the same way as me in certain recent things, and didn't, you know, and have different kind of opinions. So I see both sides of these things, and so I'm shared an enormous amount of things that they absolutely 100% believe is true, and I could show them the ONS stats why that wasn't true. I can show them the papers from Parliament about why that wasn't true. I can point them to as many things at universities as I can get my hands on. Doesn't change any of their opinions. They just believe that I'm part of the elite, the metropolitan elite, even though I grew up on the same street as them, and that actually I'm just blagging it. So that doesn't change any of it. But also the other way around. Like if it's something that plays to my prejudices, I'm pretty sure I'm as bad. Like I could pretend I'm not. but I'm probably as...
How do you fix that then?
Yeah,
What's the cure?
Well, I was just going to, again, it's kind of taking a slight tangent, but one of the things that Ushahidi gets really involved in is about how you build and sustain a resilient community, and what that does for the overall process of peacefulness, understanding, and coming to agree or coming to agreements. And we've done a lot of work recently in Rwanda around the genocide and how people have managed to reconcile a lot of the differences there. Amazing work has been done in Rwanda there. And we're currently embarking on a similar project within Kenya, and how do we build a more peaceful society there, and what does that do to have a knock-on effect to these kinds of things, and how also can we learn from how well Rwanda has done that kind of
So bring that learning to the UK.
Yeah, bring that learning to the UK, for sure.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on. Can I go to question number 3, please?
Software as a service is very lucrative, especially for cloud providers, but it's also created tensions between the open source creators and community, because popular projects often don't benefit from a return contribution of code or revenue. When does it become unethical to use open source software without contributing back?
So should the platforms be contributing back to the software that they use and benefit from? Melinda?
I want to defer to Errol on this one.
Can you do that?
No!
I just did it. Yeah.
Decided this previously.
We had a pre-discussion on this, and we
Is this
decided
like-
she's the one.
Oh, thank you. I hope I'll do this justice. Just a quick poll though, of the projects here so Ushahidi is open source. Are there other open source, just out of curiosity?
We contribute to open source.
Okay, cool.
Google has bits.
Sweet. Okay.
If you
Sweet. Okay, good to know. Yeah, so I've had a few conversations about this, very in-depth, involved one with my colleagues this morning. I think that there are very contextual circumstances around whether it's unethical to not contribute if you've used something. And I think it kind of comes down to a few different things, like, are you profiting from your use of open source? Are you able to contribute to open source? So I find particularly this part fascinating. So if you are using a piece of open source software or an open source platform, you're doing good with it. And this kind of goes on the basis that your open source project that you are involved in is a project that does good, not necessarily one that, because I know there's all kinds of open source projects. Hang on a second. It's that awful cold. But yeah, I don't think that we could say that somebody is being unethical if they are unable, either skills-wise, time-wise, resources-wise, to not contribute to that open source project. One of the projects that we're working on, again, at Ushahidi, is how do we involve more people in open source work that aren't necessarily from the tech background. So we're looking at how to involve people that work in international development, so your development workers, locally and internationally. What is their perception of open source? I mean, I've definitely done user testing research with international development workers who've looked at the term GitHub and said, I think Git means something completely different to me, which is a fascinating piece of user research. But so how can we facilitate contributions in a different way? So around that kind of work, less becoming, less the subject of inquiry, the subject of testing, and more bring it towards a relationship where they feel like they're openly contributing to things where their unique experience of working within those communities, working on those development projects, for the kind of work that Ushahidi does, is massively beneficial to how we then build our software products. And we're also working on a project of how to include designers, like how can you open source design work? So I think there's ways that we can solve those kind of problems. But yeah, there was a specificness around the software as a service sort of model, wasn't there? So.
Because I think there are, and correct me if I get this wrong, but there are license models in place which mean that if you take a piece of open source software and you build a product, I think the example I was giving you earlier was if you build a modem with an open source database in it. Quite why you do that, I don't know. But then you owe a license fee. But if you build your modem and you stick it in a data center, and you sell that as a service, then you're not required to pay the same fee. So as more and more things become software as a service, the people who have invested a lot of their time, or their companies have allowed them to invest a lot of time in building that open source software, are suddenly on the back foot because they just don't have the resources to keep up with the amount of work that's required to keep the platform going.
So I was just going to say
go
that, if it's open source and it's genuinely been licensed as open source, there is no license fee. Yep. That's a complete misreading of open source.
Depends on the license.
Yeah,
Depends on the license.
But if it's a license that requires a license fee, it's not open source, and I fight to death on that.
I'm not going
at that point, because there are lots of licenses, but if something, there is a well established definition of open, about what that means and what that looks like as far as open source. And also, I'd slightly challenge this question. So, if we're talking about it being SaaS, and about it being kind of the big, and then talking about the big cloud providers. If you're talking about, even Azure and AWS and Google, actually, they pretty much underpin about 80% of the current open source communities. So they basically, half the code was theirs in the first place that people are regularly using. They've got staff working full-time on it. They're contributing financially to it because they need to, because they're not in it for the good of the community. They're in it for financially. But for all those big ones, they need to keep improving those things, keep making them more ready for the cloud, make them ready for the enterprise. And the easiest way for them to do that is for them to have people contributing to it from day one and all the way along the line. Now, some of that around the edges is iffy, I know, but actually I do think that they do contribute in that space pretty comprehensively. And Drupal has Acquia and WordPress has Automatic, and so there are all these kind of spaces in there where there is a commercial relationship, where they do give back. And at that high level, that really big financial, the ones with deep pockets, I think they're pretty good for the most part. I mean, as a level down, I don't know enough about it, and maybe it starts to get a little bit more taking advantage of the situation.
Can I come back to the question? Are there projects which you know of that are struggling to maintain their platforms?
Well, the reason I'm asking is because we've had people change their licenses recently. So you've got Redis Labs change their license, and then you've got MongoDB as well change their license. Because the feeling of, particularly from Redis, was that they were supplying software that they felt they weren't actually getting a return for financially, and that they were struggling because of it. And I guess it's that sort of tension that I'm sort of kind of asking about, really. Okay. And sort of saying, well, maybe some of these bigger companies, shouldn't they actually dip into their pocket and contribute a percentage back that they earn from the software that they use? Not forced to do that, but they're actually encouraged to be transparent about the amount of money that they contribute to the projects, so that the people who are using the software actually make a decision about which companies they support. So, sort of like with the internet, the sysadmins were the kingmakers doing, with their servers. This is an opportunity, for big companies to say, yes, we are supporting these projects financially, and this is how much we're actually spending, so being very clear about it, and then allowing sysadmins, developers, engineers, and CTOs actually to say, right, I'm going to support that company because they are maintaining the ecosystem, and those companies that don't will by default find themselves in a difficult position.
I like the idea of that transparency.
Yeah.
I think just generally knowing who's behind what wouldn't hurt anyway, and how and to what extent they were would definitely be an interesting model. Absolutely.
And James, you mentioned that Dyson contributes back. Is that altruistic, or is that because you need to contribute back in order to maintain the code base that you use?
So in my particular area, it's well, altruistic is probably a very generous term. We don't have to. The license doesn't require us to, but we wanted to. I think. So I work with a bunch of developers, and all of them are keen to give something back. If a piece of software has made their lives/jobs easier, they're naturally going to want to do that. We're not completely open source. We don't open source our kind of e-commerce platform or anything like that. That's a separate thing, I guess. But in terms of where we can, we give back. I think to Matt's point, that software companies, the big three, AWS, Google, etc., they do seem to be getting better. I think Microsoft in particular, I don't know what they've been putting on their cornflakes the last 5 years, but they've open sourced, but yeah, exactly. They got rid of the idiot that was there before. They've open sourced loads and loads of stuff. They're actively engaged with the community. They're not perfect. They're still a mega corporation who want to make loads of money, but it's better. I don't think anyone should argue with progress, however small. I think it's a good thing.
And James, we were talking earlier about the impact of companies engaging properly in open source projects.
I mean, the classic example is OpenSSL, which was 2 men in a garage for a long time. And I've got here, I apologise for extremely low tech, but here's the graph of open tickets in OpenSSL. That's when the heartbeat bug was announced, and the point is, therefore, half a dozen different people, the Akamais of this world, I think Google also and others, suddenly said, wait a moment, these 2 men in a garage just can't hack it. We need to actually pitch in serious effort. And suddenly, those there, men poodle again, and you suddenly see actually the graph of what happens when companies, big companies, put in serious effort, basically because they realise it's actually in their long-term interest. Yeah. And that's the point. It is not truly altruistic. It needs a long-term interest, but it does need to look beyond next quarter's figures.
Everyone wins with that.
That example actually is from Real World Cryptography 2017. It's the first talk there. I urge everyone with any interest in this to go and look at those slides, because they really show how it went from 2 men in the garage to a properly funded, by contributions, both staff time and money, from big corporations. I mean, some of them put in staff time, others who were using it but didn't have the technical expertise put in money, secretariat supported by the Linux Foundation, etc., to being a properly industrial, still open source piece of vital infrastructure. There's a difference between infrastructure, as it were, and your own proprietary, for example, if I take Dyson as an example, your own proprietary e-commerce platform, which will probably stay proprietary, but you use all sorts of bits of infrastructure in that.
Absolutely.
Most of which you actually benefit from the fact that infrastructure is open source. Yep. And people who benefit from the fact that the infrastructure is open source are morally obliged, I think, to contribute some way or another to it, morally.
I agree.
And it is in their long-term best interest. It's not altruistic, it's in their long-term best interest, but they have to look at the long term. Yep. And just this is a fantastic example of it in a nutshell. So I recommend it. Thank you.
And Kevin, I know that GDS, as a government digital service, does what it can to encourage software that's being used at a government level to be open sourced. At an Innovate UK level, is that something that's actively encouraged, that the products and the projects that are being funded are producing and contributing back to the open source community, or does it not really come up?
It's not something that I've come across within my work at Innovate. This is a question I was dreading, actually, one I felt least capable to respond to. But I suppose I'm an example in microcosm of being a bad citizen of the open source community, because I use open source. I've got open source operating systems. I use open source Office suites, and I don't contribute back. And to some extent, I don't have the capability or the skills to do that, but I kind of tell myself that, and actually there are things that I could be doing, and maybe that's something that could be made clearer to big businesses as well, how they can contribute back. I know financial is, that's always money talks, but maybe there are other ways in which they can contribute and they can be seen to be contributing, because big businesses love a little bit of a PR push every now and again, especially when they've had a dark time. So if the open source community could make that more visible to them, and make it more of a partnership and contribution, that might be useful. And I might chuck 20 quid towards Ubuntu tonight when I get home.
We just have an example of a partnership. We recently did a sort of partnership with IBM on some of our machine learning parts of Ushahidi. And that's an example of where there was no money contribution, but there was like a mutual interest in how to progress machine learning within the data collection field, and we negotiated like hours are precious to, especially Tech for Good projects. So, and also contributing to projects that you don't necessarily use the software for. So if I have an ask of the people that are interested in contributing to things, it's to look for open source projects that you don't necessarily use on a day-to-day basis. So the people that use Ushahidi open source are not necessarily the people, there are the small groups, they're the grassroots organizations that don't necessarily have the means to time-wise or finance-wise to then contribute back. But if big organizations recognize that Ushahidi's software enables things like crisis relief in different places around the world and said, hey, let's kick in our dev open source hours into benefiting a platform which is a good platform, then I would advocate for everyone to go investigate tools.
I think, going back to the question here, we from the ethical side, you've got to look at why are people making their software open source. I mean, there's often something in it for them to make it open source. I mean, we are, without giving too much away, seriously looking at part of our software at the moment to make it open source, because what we're trying to do is big, to get people to take back control of their data is huge, and we're not going to do that by having a commercial software platform. We've got to release it. So I think really open source, it's not just about those poor developers. There's something in it in terms of doing it. I mean, we've actually, not even software, we actually open sourced a consulting framework that we gave to consultants to go out and use, and we spent loads of money developing it so they could make consulting revenues using our framework, because it would actually enable organizations to come onto our platform a lot quicker. So I think that, it's not just, there are other reasons for putting it out there.
Cool, thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, but just a little bit of time for our last question. Please, question number 4.
Do the panel expect that when they grow old, they're going to be looked after by robots, and are they looking forward to it?
Jay, let's start with you, and we'll just go around.
Well, I heard a stat today which kind of meant that either I'm going to have dementia or I'm going to be caring for someone with dementia. So I'm kind of hoping that there are going to be robots, because there's just not going to be people around left to do anything. So I hope so.
James?
Probably. It's terrifying. I don't like the idea of it. They'll either, the thing is, I think the technology in terms of their ability to do stuff will no doubt get there, but they're still going to look weird. They're not going to look quite right. It's going to be creepy. I don't want to be helped out of the bath by a robot.
I, for one, welcome our robot overlords. I mean, we're already cared for by robots in certain ways. A lot of medical robots, Roomba. Let's just.
Roomba is the.
It's the little Hoover that goes around.
Worse than the nice one.
Oh, sorry. Well, it's just anyway. Sorry. Yeah. So yeah. The more we can automate this sort of thing, it means I don't have to move back to the US to take care of my parents when they get old.
Sweet. Kevin, are you looking forward to it?
Well, it's not too far off. I turned 50 a couple of weeks ago, so yeah, I'm getting there.
Happy birthday.
I think there's two components to this. The question is, am I looking forward to being looked after by robots? And that's probably fine. As you say, we already have technology in our life that takes care of us, or looks after us. But the taking care of is the bit that's perhaps more critical. There's 1 million people in this country who are over 75 who are lonely, seriously lonely, and they're not engaging with human beings, which causes depression. It makes you stressed. It can make you very ill. And it's that taking care of piece that I don't think robots can do, because they don't care about us. And we can't replace people in that human interaction with bits of plastic. So it'd be great for the looking after, hopeless at the caring for.
So Errol, are you looking forward to it, and do you think perhaps there's an opportunity to use robots to increase access to other people and make people more mobile, perhaps?
So looking after and caring for, I think, is maybe not the right words to use here. I think the supporting of and enabling and assisting is really important. I'm going to do a very quick shout out to 2 of my favourite Bristol-based assistive tech companies. One is Smartbox, that make assistive technology in Bristol for people that can't use their own voice, and Open Bionics, where you can open source print your own prosthetic limbs. And I think this is really important. I think that I hope that it becomes more of a thing where it's supporting and assisting rather than a complete overtaking. I think it's really important to be super involved in how the process develops. But yes, I'm looking forward to how we can help more people become as involved in society as what we would deem able-bodied people at the moment.
James.
Well, I turned 65 recently. I'm much looking forward to being looked after by robots, not being looked after at all, which is the alternative, as you said. But I mean, anyone who gets in the lift to go down to visit their neighbour further down the block of flats is being looked after by a robot in one sense. Where do you draw the line? I'm looking forward to a case of much greater automation of the more routine side of it, and so on. I would not particularly look forward to a life of being looked after by robots only. But that's a very different thing. But we need that level of automation. We need the automatic Hoover bots and so on, where there are just not enough housemaids in the world otherwise. Yeah, we need it.
Matt. Any last comments?
Yeah, so I don't think robots will look after anybody, and I think if people watch movies, I think we're closer to the road than we are to Wall-E, particularly after Brexit. So I figure I'm going to be like one of those Eskimos. I'm going to be put onto some island and left to kind of fend myself when I can stop contributing, and that'll be the end of me. So I think that's more likely than robots looking after anybody, to be perfectly honest. I thought I'd just leave us on a nice high note. And that's it, really.
Well, so it just reminds me for me to say thank you. I know there are a couple of people who had their hands up that I haven't managed to get to, but yes, thank you very much, all of you, for coming.